So, in the last few months, people on the right have been developing new strategies as to how to push our ideas into the mainstream and make ourselves seem more human, frankly, as the you know who controlled media dehumanizes us and dismisses us and characterizes us as all violent terrorists and horrible people and supremacists and such. And we got a lot of pushback for this. People that say, well, you shouldn't advocate for Palestinians because if they were in positions of power, they would hate you, they would oppress you, they would attack you because Muslims hate you. Which is, I mean, to even entertain the hypothetical is ridiculous. To even think that these rock throwers that are essentially in a concentration camp of their own, walled in by Israeli forces, shot if they even approach the walls, to think that these people are in any position to oppress us is delusional and schizophrenic, to be honest with you. And then they say, well, why do you try to build solidarity with black people in America? You see these riots, you see how they're tearing down your statues. Endless videos are constantly being passed around Twitter of gangs of black people just beating white people savagely, just savage brutalizations. And it's very understandable to react with anger toward that. It's very understandable for someone to look at that and say, well, these are not my friends. These are people that hate me and want to kill me and want to destroy me. But it's also, you have to take a step back and sort of realize that this isn't all of them. This is a certain subsect, and you have to understand how we got here and why we're at this point. Blacks do not have any more control in the United States or anywhere else in the world than what Tiny Hat Gang gives them. Right? It's not, they did not seize power on their own. They were a tool. They were a tool for Jews to ascend the hierarchies throughout the 19 well really 40 from 1945 onward. Although some would say it started back in the early 1900s with the NAACP and such. But the point is, when you box us in and you say that the only way that you can ever advocate for the interests of whites is to constantly talk about whites, and that you should never do any sort of outreach or ever point out that other people are also victimized by the system because those groups are also in competition with you, because those groups are also not necessarily monolithically friendly to you. This is not a good argument, and it's also crippling to us because, look, I don't support Palestinians cynically. I don't just do it from the standpoint of, oh, I don't like Israelis and so I'm going to support their enemies. That's part of it. That's certainly a primary director of it. But also just when I see videos, years ago when I was sort of a more liberally minded kid, I used to watch these videos of Israeli helicopters dropping white phosphorus in apartment buildings, burning little babies right to the bone with chemical burns from weapons that were banned by the Geneva Convention. This sort of brutalization that is not only carried out by Israel but seems exclusive to Israel. They are the only ones that are allowed to do this with impunity. It really does sicken any person with any good moral conscience. And, you can say, well, we should reserve our sympathy for our own and sort of become cold to the plight of other people. But I'm reminded of what used to hear from old white nationalists in the 1980s and 90s. They used to talk about being dragged down into the mud, right? Being dragged down into the same situation as the lower people, right? And they used to accuse other minorities of doing this. But in a way, everyone has been dragged down into the mud. Look at when I look at these thugs or these brutal animals just savaging people in the streets. It becomes clear that these people are not equal, and nobody's trying to peddle the idea that they are. However, I also then look at the Nation of Islam, and I see these men in suits who are historically literate, who are playing classical instruments and attempting to uplift their own people. And I understand that there's a valley of difference between these two groups. These people are not monolithic, and this is a thing. A lot of people on our side seem to have a hard time arguing race with leftists because they say, well, there are people of different potential in every race, but every race and every group has a range of potential. You can be uplifted into, the greatest thing you could possibly achieve. Perhaps, someone of a certain intelligence can be educated and be literate and, achieve a certain intellectual prowess. Or he can just be inundated with propaganda and, essentially just demoralized and browbeaten into a sort of a slug of a human being. And anyone can have this happen to them. Everyone has a range of what they could achieve. And so I think that for blacks, that range, just like for whites, has been diminished to the point where they are essentially ghettoized by the circumstances that Jews have put them in. And this is why we have this sort of leverage. We can point this out and point out why they're in these plights to begin with. Because everything that they do to these people, everything that Tiny Hat Gang does to these people, they then pawn off on us and they say we're responsible for it. So from their perspective, we are essentially the Jews, and this is how the rest of the world looks at us. This is why you have people in Iran saying "Death to America." This is why the Palestinians look at us with hatred and disdain, because they don't understand, just like most people in our countries don't understand. But it's our job to make them understand. That's the point. We have to make people understand. And frankly, if you're not willing to do everything possible to win, then there's no point in even engaging in these sorts of politics. Because people keep saying to me, do you really think that when we take power, do you think that these people are then going to help you push their own people out? Well, no, I don't think that's going to happen, but I don't think it's really relevant if we never seize power to begin with. I mean, that might be a struggle that has to happen. And maybe we'll end up being dominated by Arabs or something, but even if that's possible, it doesn't really matter, because if you just sit back and do nothing, then that is going to happen, because that's what Tiny Hat Gang wants to do to us, right? They're the ones that brought these people in. They're the ones that opened the gates for them. So, it's sort of an irrelevant argument. We're doing what's necessary to take power. We're doing what's necessary to undermine the influence of the quote unquote elites. And, if you're not going to do that, and maybe you want to make a tactical argument against it and say, this actually isn't going to help us ascend the hierarchy. This isn't going to help us break into the mainstream and convince people. If you want to make that argument, I'm perfectly open to that. But what I don't like are these people that attempt to purity spiral in the most impotent ways possible, that really just undermine our ability to do anything at all and just make us out to be the caricature that the media paints us as. These sort of like just frothing at the mouth, hateful bigots. And there's perfectly good reasons to be that way. When you see these brutalizations, when you see the rape statistics, when you see all of these things, it's perfectly reasonable to react in the way that many people are. But you have to think long term, and you have to think big picture here, excuse me. Because if you're interested in winning what is essentially a war, and this is a war, you have to be willing to compromise. And that's not to say that we should just allow non-whites into our group or into our tent. I'm not looking to do a sort of Jason Kessler big tent woke minority thing, and we certainly shouldn't allow Tiny Hat Gang to convince us to let their people into our groups. What I am saying is that where possible, where we share common ground with these people, we should attempt to make coalitions on our terms. In other words, don't compromise your principles. Don't ever say, well, I'm going to adopt this principle to maintain an alliance with other people. Don't ever do that. But if we already share a common enemy or a common goal with another group of people, there's not really any good reason not to be willing to partner with them, at least in the short term, in order to achieve that goal. That's just common sense. And it's really disheartening to see the number of people in our milieu that don't understand this and don't see this and attempt instead to deflect and call you a Duganist or a communist or a liberal or this, that, and the other. It's just short-sighted, and I'm sorry that these people don't understand it. But frankly, it's not very smart. It's not optimal, and it seems to me that this has been facilitated partly by Trump's presidency. I think that a lot of people got the sense that we had the power, and a lot of people that I respect reinforced this years ago, that we had the power. We got Trump elected, right? If it wasn't for us, he wouldn't have got elected. Well, now we know, of course, that there was a section of the elite that were backing him the entire time. These billionaires that were backing him, that wanted him in power. And it may not have been the entire establishment, but it was enough to help him. And I think without those people, he never would have been elected. And so I think a lot of people have this inflated sense of power, like we have more influence than we really do. And we don't need these groups. We should just focus on our own. We should reserve everything of our own. And, short term, that might sound like a good idea, but there's going to come a time when the inescapable fate that these people have in store for us is really starting to sink in, and you're going to be desperate enough at that point that you'll be willing to make any coalition possible to get out of that situation. And frankly, I'd rather just do it now when we still have the power to be able to leverage these coalitions on our terms, rather than when we're so destitute, so desperate that we're willing to work with anyone who's willing to advocate for us on any level. And of course, as our numbers decrease, as our power decreases over the years, as these people slowly strangle us out of existence, that is going to be the case. So if you're not willing to do what's necessary now, you're going to have to do what you have to later on. And that's not a situation I think anyone wants to be in. So thank you and good night.